So I'd like to take a moment to welcome everyone today to ADL's third installment of Path to Understanding, Advocacy in Action. Today's webinar is a discussion, a panelist-based discussion with our esteemed panel here today. We'll be using the chat feature in order to give questions to our panelists. The chat feature can be found at the bottom of your screen. These questions will go directly to the panelists and our moderator. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our wonderful panel. We're so excited to have them here today. Our first person here today is our Nevada State Attorney General, Aaron Ford. Nevada Attorney General was sworn in as Nevada's 34th Attorney General in 2019 and is the first African American to take a statewide constitutional office. Before being elected as Attorney General, AG Ford served as the Majority Leader of the Nevada State Senate. Welcome, Attorney General Ford. Our next panelist is Nelson Araujo, State Director for U.S. Senator Jackie Rosen. Nelson is a proud Nevada native and the current State Director for our U.S. Senator Jackie Rosen. He previously served in the Nevada Assembly for 2 consecutive terms. Prior to serving in public office, Nelson worked for the office of the United States Senator Harry Reid. Welcome, Nelson. Our third panelist today is Alyssa Nave-Worth, shareholder at Greenberg Traurig. Alyssa has more than a decade's worth of experience in politics and government affairs. She has deep legal, political, and public policy experience in Nevada, which she uses to implement and advocate for legislative strategies before state and local agencies for a wide range of corporate clients. She maintains strong relationships with lawmakers and regulators and has a reputation for honesty and integrity with her clients. She's also serving as ADL's pro bono lobbyist. Welcome to Alyssa. And last, but certainly not least, our moderator, Jolie Brislin, who's the Regional Director of ADL Nevada. Jolie has been with ADL since 2008 and serves as the Regional Director for the Anti-Defamation League here in Nevada. She works closely with staff and lay leaders to implement various programs that focus on anti-Semitism and an array of civil rights issues, one of the most important being ADL's anti-bias programs in schools. She also collaborates with law enforcement, elected officials, and community members to build bridges of communication that focus on understanding and respect among diverse groups. Welcome to all of our esteemed panelists and our moderator today. With that, I'm going to pass it off to Jolie to tell us a little bit about ADL and kick off our discussion. Jolie?
Thank you, Katrina. And for all of those, for everybody who's been joining us on our webinar series, Kat has just done a phenomenal job bringing some of the issues that are affecting us most in this moment to us in our living rooms or wherever we might be working virtually. And so, Kat, thank you so much for your hard work. ADL is a leading hate organization. We were founded in 1913 in response to the escalating climate of anti-Semitism and bigotry. But our mission is timeless, and it's to protect the Jewish people, but to secure justice and fair treatment for all, which truly guides us. Today, ADL continues to fight all forms of hate with that same vigor and passion. And we're like Kat said, ADL is a global leader in exposing extremism and delivering anti-bias education and working with law enforcement on hate crimes. And so, those are some of the interesting things that we're working on, as well as securing justice and fair treatment for all under civil rights, community engagement, freedom of speech, marriage equality, immigration reform, religious freedom, so on and so forth. Why we're here today, though, is to talk about advocacy and action. And ADL investigates, educates, and advocates. And some of the initiatives that we do that we're working on right now are Backspace Hate, which is ADL's initiative in supporting victims and targets of online hate and harassment by raising awareness and passing passing legislation to better hold people accountable for online hate, which is something that we've had conversations with our Attorney General, and we're very excited to continue those conversations. Our other initiative that we're working on at this moment, and many people probably have heard about it, is our Stop Hate for Profit. And this initiative just came out about 2 weeks ago. And ADL led a coordinated campaign called Stop Hate for Profit. And the results of months of coordination between the ADL, Common Sense Media, the NAACP, Color of Change, and Sleeping Giants. What it is we're asking all businesses to stand in solidarity with our most deeply held American value of freedom, equality, and justice by taking a pause on Facebook services in July. This campaign has gone viral and it's all over the news, social media, and we have over more than 100 campaigns that have reevaluated advertising for the month of July. That include North Face, Coca-Cola, Starbucks, Ben & Jerry, and Verizon. And this goal the goal of this campaign is to send a message to Facebook, a powerful message, that our profits will never be worth promoting hate, bigotry, racism, anti-Semitism, and violence. And so we are looking, and we've been working with asking Facebook these questions, and we're hoping to get the answers that will make Facebook and social media safe for us all. And we know that everyone on this call as well is in favor of safe online space. So thank you. So before we get started, we want to open this up to our panelists. Which is why we're all here today, to have a better understanding of where we are and what's happening within the state of Nevada. And so on our panel today, we have a history of leading the efforts of civic engagement in a number of ways. We have past legislators, we have as constitutional office, as legal advocates, of course, Attorney General Ford and Nelson have spent the last decade fighting for the rights of all Nevadans, including those that have been historically marginalized in the political process. Alyssa Naveworth is a legal advocate who represents communities that have frequently not had a voice throughout who have frequently not had a voice. In addition to other traditional lobbying clients, we're very thankful that all of these people here today are sharing their voice and their vision for the state of Nevada. Before we go any further, we would like to hear from General Ford and Nelson as to why they ran for office and what their initial thoughts were when they first went to Carson City. We are focused on Nevada's communities, many of whom aren't accustomed to engaging in the political process. Were able to speak their voice and play a role along with your contemporaries in the legislature. So can you guys share with us a little bit about your thoughts on when you first went to Carson and what that was like?
I think General Ford should kick it off, yeah?
Yeah, okay. Hi, I'm still trying to figure out how to use Zoom, although I've been using it a little bit now. I'm still not proficient. So hopefully everybody can see me. Thank you so much, ADL, for having me on. My name is Aaron Ford, and I'm your Attorney General. Delighted to be here to talk about advocacy and the importance of it. To your question initially of why I ran for office. When I ran for office the first time, I said there were 4 reasons, and they went by the names of Avery, Alexander, Devin, and Deuce, my 3 sons and my nephew. Specifically, it related to education. I was quite concerned about the level of education funding in our state and the resources that have been provided to them. I had, at that point, children who were entering every level of our schooling, from kindergarten to middle school to high school to graduating. And I was amazed at the fact that my then kindergartner, who had done nothing wrong, if you will, was a subject of receiving less money as a kindergartner than the class right before him, merely because he had been born 1 year later. And so that was my initial impetus in getting into public policy and getting into the legislature. I figured I could throw stones from the outside, or I can get on the inside and try to help address some of these issues, especially with my background in education. Once in the legislature, though, I didn't win the first time. I was actually smashed. Took a couple years before I was actually able to become a state senator. But once in, my focus immediately expanded, and it expanded to things that have always been important to me, including the issues of advocacy and equality. and understanding the importance of speaking to issues of import, irrespective of negative feedback you may receive, irrespective of the opportunities for disagreement, understanding that there are important things to be said, especially from a position of power. One of the mottos that I began to live by was always speak truth to power, even from a position of power, because otherwise you lose opportunities to effect real change. And so ensuring that we talked about equal access education was one thing, but also talking about equality in all that we do, and ensuring that it permeated the entirety of our legislative process, but also the entirety of our laws. And I found it quite interesting, frankly. You go in kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and hoping that all it takes is a conversation and some compromise. But oftentimes there is a system that is set up, frankly, to avoid change. And oftentimes the difficulties in effectuating change are embedded within the system. And sometimes politics get in the way, which is all the more reason why you have to continue to speak up and continue to speak out and continue to advocate for things, even if others want to try to shut down the conversation or to disallow the opportunity for change to take place. I'm loath to mention this out loud, but it's important to note that as we talk about advocacy and as we talk about equality, that systemic racism exists. It exists in the areas of police reform that we are hearing about now in the aftermath of George Floyd, but it also exists in other systems. It exists in our educational system. It exists in our economic system and in our housing system. And yes, it exists in our political system. One of the first experiences that I had in the political system was to have to explain to my children, frankly, why some of my actual colleagues, elected legislators, were overheard stating that they would vote to bring back slavery, for example, and explaining to my kids how anybody in this state could be elected to a position of authority who still would put them back in chains was something that I had to explain to my kindergartner all the way to my senior in high school. And then having to explain why other elected officials said out loud that Black people were not grateful enough for the role that white people played in ending slavery, an institution that they themselves have started, right? And so this conversation is something that is embedded at every level, and it is not a conversation of my parents' generation only, or my grandparents' generation only, or of even, frankly, my own generation. Just ask my children in their generation about the conversations they have to have. Again, all the more reason to talk about advocacy and the importance of speaking out. So again, thanks for having me on here, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
And I will, jump on that. So I was 26 when I first ran for office in 2014. And I still remember running for the state assembly. And that year wasn't the greatest election year for many reasons, but what it did is I think it reminded so many of us who were elected and were sent back to Carson City that there was a real big fight ahead of us, and that a lot of the issues that had not risen as a priority in prior years was now going to be a big fight. And I think in many ways it was preparing us for what's come and what's transpired. And so for me, it was always being that Nevada native kid, right? It was just growing up in Nevada, loving my state, wanting to do all I could to give back to our community. And one of the things that I always reminded folks was that I knew my seat in the assembly was a borrowed seat. I knew it did not belong to me, but I also knew that I had an obligation to the constituents of my district to always stand up and to speak out against everything that was wrong. One of the other things that I always talked about was the importance of fighting for hardworking families. My mom, a union housekeeper, to this day, 34 years now, working at the same hotel as a housekeeper amidst COVID. And so, these were the stories that I took pleasure in bringing in. But I would be remiss if I didn't. I'm so grateful to be a part of this panel, and General Ford and my leader in the House, Speaker Frierson. They're really the ones that we need to be, thanking for a lot of the progress that we see today here in the state. They, as our leaders in the chambers, at least when I served in office and before Speaker Frierson, Leader Marilyn Kirkpatrick, but they were the ones that were taking it in the chin day to day and really having those tough conversations and really standing up for hardworking families and moving our caucuses the right way, so that we could also have that shield and that protection to be able to stand up and speak out. And so, that's why I ran for office. My experience in office was always a great one. And one of the things that, I talk about so often now is it really gave me so many tools to be able to now serve in this capacity for my boss, Senator Jackie Rosen. And it really allowed me to understand a lot of the ins and outs of Nevada, and to appreciate all of our state, and really take that to this level where now we're looking at things through a federal lens to see how we can support the great Silver State.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nelson. Attorney General Ford, I think something that many people have asked me, and so I would love for you to have an opportunity to share, is what does the Attorney General do? What do you oversee? And what does the daily life, a life in the day of General Ford look like?
Yeah, there is no such thing as a day in a life, because it's different, frankly, every single day. But the general role that we play, when I ran for office, I tried to describe it as the people's lawyer. I represent the people of the state of Nevada, not you individually, obviously, but you as the Nevada family. And the way that I try to categorize my decision-making process is when I look at what's happening either external to our state vis-a-vis the federal government, or internal to our state vis-a-vis, for example, businesses operating and interacting with our constituencies. If something is negatively affecting the Nevada family, then the Attorney General is supposed to speak up and speak out and sometimes even file a lawsuit. In the Nevada family, I define very broadly, whether you've been here 3 generations or 3 weeks, whether you are an individual who's married with 2.5 kids or a single mom with 3 kids, whether you are a member of the LGBTQ community or whether you are single and stagging, it doesn't matter. You are a member of the Nevada family. And if things are negatively occurring that negatively affect members of the Nevada family, then I, as the Attorney General for the state, am supposed to speak out relative to litigation if I have to. But I also serve as the general advisor for all of our, for example, constitutional officers. So the governor, the treasurer, the lieutenant governor, the controller, the secretary of state. I serve as their legal counsel, and I represent them and advise them on a day-to-day basis relative to the needs that they have, as well as all of the administrative agencies in our state. So HHS, the Department of Corrections, the Department of Education, whatever the case may be, my office serves as their counsel as well. What most people know, though, is that I'm also the top law enforcement officer in the state, meaning I put some people in jail. I have very limited jurisdiction in that regard. So elder abuse, child-based issues, and a few others are within my what we call primary jurisdiction. But I'm also a law enforcement official. I have a badge, I wear a badge, and in the context of today's conversations around, for example, police reform and George Floyd, I utilize the unique intersection that I have as an African-American male, but also a member of law enforcement, at least nominally, to try to help bridge gaps in the communication on issues that are so important for us today. So, that's a brief summary of what the Office of Attorney General does.
That's wonderful. And it is definitely interesting as the first African-American elected statewide, right? And overseeing law enforcement in the moment that we're in. I would love if you can kind of go a little bit deeper into your thoughts of what you're seeing. But also, I mean, you oversee your relationship, obviously, with Las Vegas Metro. They definitely have a lot of best practices in terms of the Multicultural Advisory Committee, where really brings law enforcement and the community together to have these tough conversations and to be proactive versus reactive. So if we can get your thoughts on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I work as frequently as I can, hand in hand with law enforcement across the state. I don't oversee law enforcement. Let's be clear about that. Metro has a sheriff, and they have an agency to which, or a county to which they report, in this instance, Clark County. And those issues are more, I'm sorry, my phone's ringing there. Hope you don't hear that. But I do try to work with them hand in hand, and especially during times like this. I mean, we're talking about advocacy. And people can advocate from wherever they are. I advocated for equality before I was elected, while I was elected in the state Senate, and I absolutely try to use my platform at this juncture as the top law enforcement officer in the state to advocate for police reform in order to improve community relations between law enforcement and the communities in which they operate and to whom they serve. What I've said is that there are, there's an opportunity here. But I must admit that in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd, when I saw what happened, I'm so conditioned as a Black man in our country, so conditioned to immediately say, here we go again, and ain't nothing gonna happen. So excuse my colloquialism, but that's exactly how I thought. And that's exactly how I can guarantee you the vast majority of Black Americans feel as well when they see a Black man die at the hands of police. Here we go again, and ain't nothing gonna happen. It could be the police, it could be retired policemen, come here, Georgia. It could be a vigilante, come here, Florida. Or it could be an actual police officer, come here, Minneapolis. And the question is, what's gonna actually happen here? What I was so happy to see, though, was that immediate, and happy I put in quotes, because who's happy to have to look at this from, after someone has been killed? But I was delighted to see that in the immediate aftermath, law enforcement across the country came together and recognized and condemned the inappropriate interaction that the officers of Minneapolis had with George Floyd. I think that part of the benefit, if you will, the silver lining, if you will, of us being quarantined because of COVID is that we have less distractions. You can't just turn on the TV and watch football right now. You can't just go to the bar and kick it with your friends right now. What you're seeing on a daily basis is a reminder of what Black Americans have been complaining about for not the last decade, not even the last generation, but for generations on end. And so speaking to the issue about improving relations between law enforcement and the communities they serve is something that I've endeavored to do over the course of this time period, having held, I think, a half a dozen at this point, what I call justice and injustice forums or panels, talking about actual tangible changes. And the reason why I say talking about them right now is because that's all that we've been able to do. And the conversation should be near over. Conversing is cool, but what we need are actual implementation of policies being passed and implemented. But beyond that even is the actual enforcement of those and ramifications when people avoid or when people don't adhere to their trainings. And so what I'm hopeful for is that we're going to start to see some accountability take place in the public eye, so that I am no longer conditioned to think nothing's going to happen, but instead conditioned to think I know justice will be meted if it's so deserving.
Thank you, General Ford, for that honest conversation, for that honest answer. These are definitely difficult times, and the conversations that we're having in the coalition partners that ADL has, as well as with law enforcement, is that, the one thing that law enforcement can agree on is that the worst thing for law enforcement is the one thing that all law enforcement hate is a bad officer. And so trying to figure out how can we implement anti-bias training, how can we make sure that we're having these conversations proactively, and so we thank you for always being a lead voice in providing that platform. Nelson, I would love to just have a moment to kind of share from your point of view as a legislator, right? What were your responsibilities and especially kind of thinking about the moment that we're in, and the responsibilities of other legislators as we're seeing special sessions take place, but what was your thoughts on representing unique communities in Nevada?
I think it's the same lens that we're operating through now. In the 2015 legislative session, General Ford will remember this, but one of the big issues that I particularly tackled was transgender related issues with our transgender youth, where we had horrific policies that were being proposed that would ostracize our youth simply because of discrimination. And so, General Ford hit it on its head. I mean, this is such a wide spectrum of there's such a wide spectrum of topics that we can cover. But what I'd love to do is talk about what we're doing now at the federal level, right? Because as I mentioned, serving in the State House prepared me for this new role. And one of the things that I've been so happy about is that we have 2 U.S. senators who are fighting for us every single day in DC. We have a Nevada delegation that has, in very many respects, stayed united in our stance against hate. We have in my boss, the 3rd Jewish senator and someone who started the first ever task force to combat anti-Semitism, a bipartisan task force that now has has 40 senators, both from both parties that are members of it. We have a delegation that is pushing in the House a Justice and Policing Act, and in the Senate as well. And you have proposals like the 1619 Act and the Never Again Education Act, which are serving as a tool for not just Nevadans but for the country to be able to have these conversations and to have these academic tools available to educators so that they can teach the generation of tomorrow the history of yesterday, the history of the Holocaust, the history of racism, the history of slavery, and so on and so forth. And so, that has been what, to me, has been the most impressive thing. I brag about the entire Nevada delegation all the time, but the federal delegation couldn't do it without the support of the state delegation, and the support has been there from day one in Governor Sisolak and General Ford, and this is top of mind, and this is what makes Nevada so great, right? We know and we recognize that we have a lot of changes that need to be made, but we're always willing to have that conversation, and we're always willing to address these tough issues and really try to find common ground. And, as my boss would put it, work where we can, fight where we must, and try to find more work where we can options so that we could really get some really good progress done. And so, my experience in the State House is very similar to General Ford's, but what I've really loved seeing over the past few years is how that transpires across every spectrum of government, whether it's local, state, all the way to federal.
Thank you, Nelson. And the relationship that the ADL has with Senator Rosen is a very special relationship. We've been very thankful that we've been able to work on our Never Again Act. And of course, in the times of rising anti-Semitism and hate, to see her take the lead in a bipartisan idea with Senator Langford was just, it was wonderful to see that hate has no side. And that's a really important message, and we all have an obligation to speak out against it. And so we definitely thank Senator Rosen for that. You spoke a little bit about the 1619 Act as well as the Never Again Act. And I know you kind of put that together in your statement, but for those people who are not familiar with those, can you just give one sentence about each of them?
Yeah, and so the Never Again Education Act was signed into law, and essentially what it does is it creates grant opportunities for our Holocaust Museum to provide academic tools to educators across the nation. The 1619 Act is very similar to the Never Again Act, and essentially what that does is it provides grants to be made available to educators to be able to educate our youth on racism and the history of America and slavery and everything that has brought us to where we're at today, and having these conversations. And so the 1619 Act, again, a bill that was co-sponsored by my boss, the Never Again Education Act. Senator Rosen led that charge, and it was wonderful to just be able to see folks from both sides of the aisle, gather and do something that I think many would argue is long overdue, and so necessary in these moments.
Thank you, Nelson. Alyssa, we have not forgotten about you. For those of you who are joining us today, Alyssa Nave is ADL's pro bono lobbyist, and the passion that she has for combating hate and speaking out against injustice is just inspiring. And we're so lucky to be able to work alongside her every day. Thank you, Alyssa, for joining us. You've worked with a lot of nonprofits over your career, and here we're asking you to kind of share from an advocate's perspective the importance of engaging in the political process. Can you share what a lobbyist does and what that looks like?
Well, lobbyists can be lawyers or non-lawyers. I happen to be a lawyer. But it doesn't matter, because the truth is that, to be a lobbyist, you are just a person that's trying to participate in the process and understand and make sure your voice is heard. So we engage in every aspect of it. It's exactly what, if you wanted to get involved in participating in the political process, you would do also. So for example, and I think that there's 4 ways of critical engagement. The first thing that we do is we work to help elect the right people. And 2 examples of the right people are on this call. I have been honored to know General Ford since he was first that candidate in the race, and I can tell you lots of stories about that, but it was the first time in that race that even though he lost, he showed his true integrity as a human being, and what an incredible advocate and asset to Nevada he would be. And so there's no surprise to me that now that we're calling him General Ford, and and I want him to be in service for as long as possible for his family, but also for my daughter, because since we met, I have brought a daughter into this world, and we need a team of elected officials that are advocating for us. Nelson Araujo is absolutely squarely within that pool. He and I have fought together for a long time. And so I would say, the first thing that we do from a professional advocate's position is that we really pay attention as to who is running. And I understand that in the daily life, the grind of everything, particularly in the time now when we're home educating our children and frankly trying to figure out how to survive in this new environment, that it seems like politics is so removed. But the truth is, now has never been a more important time to focus on who is going to run from the school board all the way up until President of the United States. And we stay vigilantly attentive to that. We meet with our elected officials, and it doesn't mean that you have to have a fancy law degree or work at a firm like Greenberg Traurig to do that. I will tell you right now, and I'm sure both of these fine gentlemen would echo me, that this is a place, especially in Nevada, where you can pick up the phone and you can talk to your representative, and you should ask them why they're running. You should give them the hard questions and make sure they match your sense of your own moral framework, because it's so important to have someone in the legislature, at the school board, or at the city council, or frankly, as Attorney General or the United States Senate, that matches your set of the kinds of morals that you would want your voice to be heard in. The second thing I think lobbyists do is we pay attention, right? We're paid to pay attention. We attend hearings, we read agendas, we see bills that are coming out. It can be confusing, but I will tell you that there are resources, and we're happy to share them with Jolie, about how you as an average citizen can do what we do. It's not rocket science. There's no key to the kingdom. There's no special holy grail. It's just that we spend a lot of time trying to pay attention to see how things are evolving from start to finish, but that's what we do. The third is that we participate in the process. So, we are in Carson City, we are at the city council meetings, we see zoning hearings, we monitor Congress. and we're part of that process. And again, that's something that I think you can do as an average citizen. I think it seems like it's difficult, but it's not, and we're going to talk more about that. And finally, what we do as fundamentally as lobbyists, and Nelson and I have worked together on many bills, as has General Ford. Our job is to educate. That is what we do. When we are talking to people that are running for office, or we maintain our relationships, the holy grail of who we are as a profession is defined by our own personal integrity. So, Nelson is going to make a decision on his own. General Ford is certainly going to make a decision on his own. My job is not to, his job is not to do what I ask him to do. His job is to get all the information from me that I can and to make the best case for myself. And he's going to be the arbiter of what he thinks is the best decision for Nevada. And so that is most fundamentally what we do, is that we're information resources. We certainly are paid to advocate for particular viewpoints, but we have to do it in a way that demonstrates integrity and goodwill. So that's kind of the beginning of what we do.
Thank you, Alyssa. I'm going to take it back to Attorney General Ford, and we have a few questions that are coming in, but before we get to the questions in the chat, I want to talk to you a little bit about the extremism that we're seeing locally throughout the state. Now, ADL has our Center on Extremism that's based out of New York City, and it's our research and investigative arm. And it's a clearinghouse for valuable, up-to-date information where we are monitoring and exposing hate where we see it, and presenting that information to law enforcement, to elected officials, to coalition partners, to make sure that everyone's able to help combat that. We've obviously have seen an increase just recently during COVID. We've had the Boogaloo Boys were here, we're in Las Vegas. We had Connor Climo, and ADL's role, like I said, is to track and monitor that. But what do you see the role in working with and combating hate and extremism in Nevada from your office?
Yeah, no, a very timely question. And, I think the answer is that we, under my administration, and frankly, under any administration, should be working vigilantly toward helping to eradicate. Now, I don't mean just mitigate, I mean eradicate it, right? If we know it's happening, we need to be addressing it. And since we've seen the rise of anti-Semitism across the nation in the last 3.5 years, and since we've seen more attacks on minority communities and on immigrant communities over the last 3.5 years, my office has been at the forefront of putting out know your rights types of things and information about to whom you should call, you should speak, or numbers at my office that you can reach out to report instances, whether it's on anti-Semitism or other discriminatory practices. And I have prosecutors ready to move on those types of areas and those types of issues. We see it. We've seen this. The people speaking on this panel right here are quite familiar with this, and this is nothing new to us. We're used to probably having personal experiences in our own lives in dealing with issues of discrimination. I think we can all attest to the fact that it's increased over the last 3.5 years, I would say, and I think that is part and parcel with verbiage that comes from political leaders. But make no mistake about it, it didn't begin 3.5 years ago. And I've given you examples of things that were said by my own colleagues in the state legislature that was less than 10 years ago. I reflect back on the very first time I was elected and sworn in, and escorting my father-in-law, then in his late 70s, back to his back to the a bus to take him to the airport, and him telling me that he was called boy till he was 40. So I mean, these are the types of discriminatory, antagonistic practices that are occurring out there, and to the extent they are actionable because people do more than just talk. My office is going to be there to prosecute, and as well as the offices of other law enforcement agencies out there. I'm happy to say that generally speaking, no one is suffering fools who engage in this mentality and this behavior. And so I will continue to be at the forefront of that to the greatest extent possible.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we've obviously worked with, we have Sovereign Citizens, Adam Woffen, Boogaloo Boys. So these are definitely, what we're seeing in our own community.
Yeah,
One of the questions.
and the truth is, they oftentimes are trying to co-opt otherwise peaceful and appropriate protests. And you mentioned the Boogaloo Boys. I mean, they were prepared to engage in domestic terrorism in the middle of a peaceful protest being put on by Black Lives Matter in the aftermath of George Floyd. And this another thing that I'm happy to see, that there are purposeful attempts at distinguishing between the peaceful protests and those who are being those who are co-opting it and engaging in violence and calling it out when they see it. So we need to be conscious about that as well.
Thank you. Sometimes we find that our enemy's enemy is our best friend. And very often in this moment, we're seeing some of that take place with extremists and protests. I want to go to, we've had a couple different questions, so we're going to open it up. One of the questions goes to what we're seeing in Chicago, Albuquerque, Portland, and how can we avoid the federal overreach that Portland is currently experiencing and that is being threatened in Chicago and in Albuquerque? General Ford.
Yeah, I take that was a question for me. And the answer is, we do like my colleague Ellen Rosenblum did in Oregon, and that's sue, which is what I've been doing, frankly, against this administration dozens of times since being in here. Now, let's be clear. There are certain things that the president can do and that the federal government can do, and they have the ultimate discretion, for example, in areas like immigration. But they still got to follow the rules. They still have to follow the strictures of how things are supposed to take place. And to the extent they are not following the rules, or to the extent no rules exist because they are not supposed to be engaging in an activity, I'm going to be there to sue. I ain't scared of them. Excuse my colloquialism. And to the extent there are any threats or efforts that are put forth by the federal government that they're going to bring stormtroopers into the state of Nevada under circumstances similar to what they have done in Portland, that they have threatened to do in Chicago and in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Nevada's Attorney General and our office will stand firm against that, and we will sue. And hopefully we will prevail. That's the tool that I have at my disposal, and I'm not afraid to use it.
Wonderful. Another question that came was, how effective, and I think this can really go to all three of you, but how effective do you think protesting is in order to bring change versus creating awareness on an issue? Alyssa?
I would say that it's not an either or proposition. I think there are two different tools of advocacy that are mutually important. I think it's incredibly important to have peaceful protests and to create a cacophony of voices outside of the traditional political realm to demonstrate that there is political will behind an issue. I think that people frankly respond to that and without that voice, it doesn't give the cover to people that are inside the building that are fighting the internal political fights necessary. So I would say you shouldn't ever give up your right to protest, and you can talk in history about many examples. You give them here in Nevada where it was the fact that there was a political groundswell of support from other Nevadans that really helped move a system in addition to those. And then the other side is advocacy, and you can't give up, say you're just going to be, if politics is about the symbolism of a building, right? So in Carson City, they call it the building, right? You have to be outside the building and inside the building, in my mind. And you have to be working it from both ends and create inside pressure, whether or not it's through advocacy and education, and outside pressure from, passionate protest and thoughtful agitation, in my mind.
A wise person once told me, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
Right. That's right. I would just add that I personally think that, we can answer that question by looking at the results that have come about after seeing our country come out in massive numbers to speak out against hate, against hate crimes, against racism, and look at the conversations that we're having now. Those were sparked by a movement that were led through a protest. And so, you know, when folks ask how effective, look at the conversations we're having today. Would we be having those conversations if we didn't have thousands of folks gather up and say, this is not okay. I have a right. I'm going to use that right. I'm going to speak out, and I'm going to bring others with me, and I'm going to engage in this conversation as much as I can to effectuate change and to make sure that the folks that are elected to represent me do the same.
You know, and I want to add this, and this is not a foreign notion what I'm about to say. Protest is part of the process. And this process can lead to progress. And I'm not talking about in the BLM context or any other, you know, any grand scale context. Think about your personal life. Think about your interpersonal relationships with individuals. If you have an issue and you're bold enough to broach it, it begins with your protest. It begins with you having a communication or a conversation with someone about something with which you disagree. And that is part of the process of reconciliation. That is part of the process that leads to potential progress, right? And sometimes the protest leads to negative progress. Let's be clear. Sometimes the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and it's not always the best result. But at the end of the day, we have to recognize that protest is in fact part of the process, which can lead to progress. And you know, I'll give you a prime example. We have BLM protests here, but let's not forget that before we had the BLM protests, we had the Reopen Nevada protests going on. We had folks who a demographic that looked very different from the BLM context, protesting the closure of our state in the name of COVID, and it was nonviolent protest. There were folks trying to co-opt that process as well, and they were dealt with accordingly. My office did not intervene with their rights to exercise the First Amendment right to protest what it was that they thought was an improper infringement on their constitutional rights. Similar, my office didn't intervene with the right of the BLM protesters to argue against what they thought was a violation of their constitutional rights under the Fourth Amendment. So, you know, these are things that we have to keep in mind, that this isn't something that is foreign or that we don't ourselves personally engage in. And when you try to bring things back to the actual individual and home level, sometimes it makes a little more sense. So I want to share that as an analogy for folks to think about.
Thank you.
One more thing I would say, Jolie, is, I mean, I'm not going to speak for certainly General Ford or Nelson, but just because you're a protester doesn't mean you don't play other roles, right? I mean, I've been part of protests throughout my career, right? When I've spoken my voice. And I've been an advocate, and I would gather to say both of these gentlemen have worked on it, whether or not in my time it was the military's discrimination of LGBTQ individuals, you know, mistreatment of workers in various settings, you know, the Equal Rights Amendment, you know, and we've all engaged in that. And frankly, I think it's a healthy thing to teach our children that they should engage in as well, because the history of America, usually massive social change happens when average Americans decide to use their voice in a vocal and collective way.
Yeah, you know what, I'm sorry. I know you want to move on to the next question, but I think along those same lines, it's important to note that just because you're not protesting or just because you're not doing something that someone else is doing, doesn't mean you're not doing something. There are so many ways to contribute to the circumstances or to the solution. I've not been to a protest. I've not been marching. As the Attorney General, I have a rule that you're not supposed to be in groups of greater than 50 people. So generally speaking, I'm not going to break the rule that I'm required to enforce. That said, I recognize resources associated with trying to arrest tens of thousands of folks, and we're not doing that either. But you know, I'm working behind the scenes, operating within my own sphere of influence, if you will, to try to effect positive change in these issues. And so you know, we should be careful about trying to say people aren't contributing to progress because they're not doing what you think they should be doing, or they're not doing something that you can even see that they're doing. Maybe they're operating behind the scenes because they don't like being seen in public. So that's something to consider as well.
And that's very important, and thank you. One of the questions that we received was, what is the best way to keep informed about the legislation on these topics? And where are the best areas to invest time, in particular, an individual's time? Alyssa?
So the Nevada legislature, www.leg.state.nv.gov, and we can certainly send that out to you, does that. I would recommend that during a special session you can watch, and you can actually also participate in all those public hearings. This upcoming special session is likely to deal with issues that we are talking about today, although they haven't been fully formed, but they will be there, and I encourage you to participate or at least watch it. I also, frankly, I use Twitter, I use other forms of news sources, staying involved in the news, getting news alerts. I mean, it's about just staying aware and making sure you check the news every day. And then the other way, I would say that, as those that aren't necessarily uniquely, paid to participate in the process, like my team and I, you should contact your legislator. The assembly members and the state senators are extremely open. People call Speaker Fryerson's cell phone and they ask to speak to the speaker, and it's the speaker who answered his cell phone. And that's true of all the members of the legislature, and frankly, many of the constitutional officers as well. And so I would encourage you to get to know your local assembly member. They'd love to get to know you. And these guys obviously can speak to that because they've been in that position, but I think that that's an incredibly important way to stay involved.
And if I could, at the federal level, I again would be remiss if I didn't put in a quick plug for our website, the Senator's website. We update it so frequently. It's rosen.senate.gov. Anything that we're putting out, we're adding to the website. We have constituent services. If you can't reach a federal agency, like Alyssa said, at the federal level, all of your electeds encourage you to reach out to their office and to share, what your thoughts are on federal policies. That's our driving force. We want to hear from Nevadans. We want to make sure that Nevadans are aware. I saw a plug in the message for C-SPAN, and yes, C-SPAN is a great tool to stay up to date with where the Senate and the House is, and how quickly it's moving, or not so quickly it's moving. But another thing you can do that's really important is to email, call any of your representatives, whether it's in the U.S. Senate, the House, or in the state ledge, and make sure that they know where you stand on a particular issue that's up for discussion.
Thank you. So as we are coming to the end of our time, and we have so many questions, and so I think that this is going to have to just be part one of the conversation. Obviously, we also just got another plug for Nevada Independent, who puts stuff up on Facebook and Twitter for this on the state level as well. Before we get into more of the community resources, I would like to just ask each of you one question. And that question is, I guess it is, what do you wish that constituents knew about advocacy and advocating for change?
I can kick this off. I think I might steal this from you, General Ford. I think recognizing that it comes in many ways, shapes, and forms, and having that understanding that, whether it's being active on social media, picking up the phone, making a call to your legislator, writing a letter, building your own network of community leaders who are interested in advancing specific policies or have identified a problem that has not been addressed, or an issue that has not been addressed. I mean, that is, truly where it's at. I'll leave us with this for this question, but one of the stories that my boss talks about often is the fact that she had a specific bill on hiring veterans, the Hire Veterans Act. It originated from a panel discussion, a roundtable discussion that she had at UNLV, where someone came up and said, hey, wouldn't it be great if? And the senator took that with her, and we turned that into a bill. And I think the same could be said by state legislators and by every member of the delegation. This is how policy comes to fruition, is by citizens stepping up, exposing the problem or addressing an issue, or highlighting an opportunity and asking for it to be addressed at a policy level.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. Look, some things you have to know is that it takes gumption, it takes courage, it takes you having some oftentimes thick skin. I've seen some of the questions in the chat, for example, asking about the ways to protest and the methods of protest, and some people disagreeing with some of the things that they're seeing here. Again, let's be clear about what's happening. You have peaceful protesters and you have rioters. They're not the same. And recognizing that there are people trying to co-opt peaceful protests, and then there's actually people who are actually engaging in peaceful protest is an important distinction to make. It's also important to note that there will be always people out there. My son's trying to take my charger. Hold on one second. There will always be people out there who will disagree with what you're doing, or who, while they may agree with your policy position, they disagree with your method and your approach. And that's fine. Again, you don't have to try to please everybody. You can't please everybody. One of the things that I learned is even some of my advocates, some of my friends who advocate for the same things I advocate for, as a general matter, disagree on some of the things, some of the decisions that I made as a legislator. And they got on me about it. And I had to, understand that was fine. The only thing that I feel compelled to be within 100% compliance with is my conscience. I don't have to be 100% compliance with the ADL, with any other organization. My conscience is what guides me on these types of things. And it's important for folks who are protesting to kind of keep that in mind. You're going to get attacked. People are going to call you anything but a child of God. And I've seen it happen so many times before. But you have to be able to withstand the attacks on that and continue to move forward, because if you don't do it, someone else may not do it. And we end up talking about this a decade down the road because no one actually stood up to make the change take place.
So I wish I had gone first, because I would have preferred those two guys. But the only thing I will say, and I sound like a broken record, I'll give you the same advice I gave to the ADL. I'm a member of the Jewish community. I am deeply proud of the work that ADL has done in our state. I'm also a Nevadan, and I went to high school with Julie. And about 3 sessions ago, she was testifying on a piece of legislation in public comment, which is fine. And I said to her, you need to amplify your voice inside the legislature. You cannot be reactive. You need to be proactive. And that would be my advice, which is, if you care about something, and that whether or not it's a big issue like police reform, or an issue that's unique to you and it has to do with your profession, whether or not you're a doctor or a veterinarian or a plumber, you will serve yourself better if you are proactive. You proactively reach out to your legislator, and you're at the table and part of that process. And I know it seems scary for an average Nevadan, because politics seems foreign, especially if you watch CNN or Fox, but that's not how it really is. It's just a group of all of us that came together at some point and decided, just like General said, to be at the table, to be in the ring, to put yourself out there and expose yourself to criticism, but be willing to share your voice, because what you're fighting for is not something that's important just to you, but to your family and the people around you.
Thank you, Alyssa. And it's whenever I'm talking to my colleagues around the country, I always tell them how unique Nevada is. And we always, here it just feels like a very, so we have so much access that other states don't have. And I think, Alyssa, you touched upon this with the speaker. But really, if you're passionate about something, there's somebody to reach out to, whether you're reaching out to an elected official's office or you want to reach out to the ADL, and we can help put you in contact and get you those resources. We want everybody to feel empowered to be active and engaged and be part of the process, because our voice amplifies all of the things that we have been talking about today and that are in this chat to move on to for next time. So thank you so much. I'm going to throw it over to Kat, but thank you to our panelists for your honesty, for taking the tough questions, and for having this conversation today. Kat?
Thank you, Jolie, and thank you again so much to our panelists. We wanted to take a moment at the end of our presentation today just to review some general resources that are available to all of us. And these will be also sent out in our follow-up email after this webinar is over and uploaded to our YouTube. So one of the things we wanted to hit on was voter registration. Registering to vote or making sure that your voter registration is up to date, your address and your physical location is one of the most important things that you can do. The link to update and check your voter registration for all 50 states will be sent out to all participants today after this call is over. The second thing is to make sure you know how to contact your elected officials. A link to contact everyone from your locally elected officials all the way to our federally elected officials will be sent out to all participants as well. And that includes things like addresses, emails, phone numbers, if there's something that you want to call on. And again, that talks to your personal preference as well. I know I saw a few questions in the chat today about what's best. And for me, it's always what you're most comfortable with. Start there and work your way up. And last but not least is to send incidents to ADL. One of the things that we do as an organization is to track incidents of hate and bias. And the more that we know, the more that we can share with elected officials, with law enforcement, and with other organizations across our state to help improve the lives of everyone here and have a better base of knowledge and understanding of what's going on. So with that being said, we want to say thank you again one more time to all of our panelists today. Thank you, General Ford, thank you, Nelson, and thank you, Alyssa, for taking the time out of your afternoon to be here with us. We look forward to future conversations with all of you, and thank you to all of our participants today as well. And we look forward to having you be a part of future programming. Thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Here.